Video in Numbers chapter 26 to 27, which has not been covered in the sermon series, but we'll be covering in the Bible studies. So take a moment to pray for yourself and your groups as well. But as we begin, Numbers 26 is quite significant in the larger story of Numbers, of course, because it's quite similar to Numbers chapter 1, because Numbers starts with preparation for the conquest, and in verse 3 we read that God commands Moses and Aaron, he says, "You and Aaron are to number by their divisions all the men in Israel 20 years old or more who are able to serve in the army." And of course, this whole incident takes place after the golden calf incident in Exodus 32 and the plague there and the Levitical law being given. And then in Numbers chapter 26, we see basically a repeat of Numbers chapter 1. It's also preparation for conquest, but there's some differences, and we'll see just as we go. The Lord said to Moses and Eleazar, who's part of the new generation, or the second generation, after Aaron had died, son of Aaron the priest, take a census of the whole Israelite community by their families, all those 20 years old or more who are able to serve in the army of the Lord, which takes place after the plague in Numbers 25, which is similar to the golden calf incident. Caught in idolatry, a plague followed of death, and thereafter a census is given. So we see that it's almost like Numbers chapter 1 is in repeat. It's a reboot. But it's quite significant, the new census of the second generation, for various things. And here are some comparisons. Firstly, in Numbers chapter 1 to 4, the main concern in this census was about the tabernacle, the camp, and the Levites. While in Numbers chapter 26, what follows the census is an explanation that the land is to be allotted to them as an inheritance based on the number of names. So in the second census, nothing is talked about regarding tabernacle, camp, and Levites, but actually about land allotment. And this is quite significant because now we're directly back to the promise of Genesis 12, 6 to 7, where God said, "This land I'll give you." Exodus 3:17, where God said, "I'll give you the land of the Canaanites, a land flowing with milk and honey." And then, of course, significantly, Numbers 14:31, when God promised that the second generation will inherit this land. And so what we see is God's already talking about land allotments as if it has already taken place, because it's now time for this promise to be fulfilled. Another significant difference, of course, is in Numbers chapter 1, verse 46. The total number was 603,550. But when we get to the second census, Numbers chapter 26, we see that not one of them, of this 603,550, was among those counted by Moses and Aaron the priest when they counted the Israelites in the desert of Sinai. Which means when this second census was given, all these people, except Caleb and Joshua, have died. And then another significant point, of course, and this is related, of course, to the judgment. Just a quick one on Numbers 14:32 to 35, where God promised that this generation, the first generation, will perish in the wilderness. And so you could say verse 64 is a fulfillment of God's promise. But then a lovely picture as well is the total number was 603,550 in the first census. But in the second census, we see that the total number of the men of Israel was 601,730 in verse 51. And what you need to see is that the number of people, the only difference here is about 2,000, which actually is a testimony to God's faithfulness in keeping his promise to Abraham. I'll make you a great nation. They remained a great nation in spite of the first generation's unfaithfulness. And this is what you need to take from this census. A couple of conclusions, and really it emphasizes God's faithfulness. Firstly, to his promises. He promised that they'll be a people, they'll have blessing and land. We're seeing God being faithful to those promises, but we also see God's promise being faithful to his promise to the second generation. As for your children, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But we also see God's faithfulness to his holiness and righteousness, because God also judged the first generation when he said, "But your bodies will fall in this desert, here they will die." And so it emphasizes the second census, God's faithfulness to his promises, but also to his holiness and righteousness. But then there's another beautiful theme that starts, you could say, with Moses, but continues with Joshua. And that's Numbers 27, verse 12 to 23, when Joshua succeeds Moses. Now, in the context, it's important to see that God affirms that Moses will die. He will not be part of this land allotment. He will not be part of this new inheritance of the land. And so Moses' plea with God in verses 15 to 17 is that God won't leave Israel as sheep without a shepherd, that he would rise up a leader who will lead them into the promised land. And that's exactly what Joshua is. He is the shepherd of God's people who will lead them into the promised land, who will ensure that these promises will be fulfilled and that God's people won't go astray. But interestingly, after Joshua's death, if you follow this theme, in Judges 17:6 and 21 to 25, we see that Israel has no leader, no true shepherd in that sense, no king. And so they were like sheep without a shepherd. Everyone did anything or everything that they thought was right in their own eyes. And it's only really until David, 2 Samuel 5:2, that Israel again has a great shepherd in David the king, who God says is the shepherd of my people. But after David, significantly, the subsequent kings, Solomon and onwards, there were one or two good ones, but overall they were all wicked shepherds who led God's people astray into idolatry. And so Ezekiel 34 verse 1 to 6, for example, describes them this way: you have ruled them harshly and brutally. They were scattered. They were terrible shepherds. And it looks like Moses' plea not to leave Israel as sheep without a shepherd is going in tatters. But wonderfully, God promises that one day, He says, I myself will tend my sheep. I will search the lost. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David. So God has not forgotten this plea not to leave Israel as sheep without a shepherd. And He promises that He Himself will be that shepherd and His servant David. And of course, we see the fulfillment of that ultimately in Jesus. But coming to the New Testament, there's two big themes pulled through from Numbers 26 to 27 that continue in the New Testament. And of course, the one is God's faithfulness to His promises and to His judgments. And so, for example, Romans, when he considers God's promises, in Romans 11:22, looking at how Israel is being judged, but yet we are made part of the blessing of the promises, like that second generation, Paul highlights for us to do this when we consider God. He says, consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God, sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in His kindness. God hasn't changed. As Paul affirms close to the end of his life, if we are faithless, like that first generation, He will remain faithful, for He cannot disown Himself. God's character, His faithfulness remains consistent. But also importantly is to see that Jesus is the good shepherd or the true Joshua. He's the ultimate fulfillment of what Joshua was meant to be. And you see, in Jesus' day, when He incarnated, when He was among us, and He looked at the people, He said when He saw the crowds, He had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like described in Ezekiel, like sheep without a shepherd. That was Moses' concern. And then beautifully in John 10, Jesus proclaims and claims, I am the good shepherd. That Ezekiel shepherd, the fulfillment, you could say, even of Moses' prayer. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He's unlike any other shepherd before. There shall be one flock and one shepherd, just like Ezekiel promised. And I give them eternal life, that promised hope, and they shall never perish. No one can snatch them out of my hand. Jesus is the true shepherd, the good shepherd, the ultimate Joshua, who will lead God's people faithfully into the new heaven and the new earth, the promised land, and no one will snatch His sheep out of His hand. And so it's important what you want your people to walk away with, of course, is firstly regarding God's faithfulness, that we can trust God wholeheartedly since He's always faithful to His promises. But also our eternal hope is secure. We don't have the same predicament as Moses. The promised new heavens and the new earth are secure since we have an eternal shepherd who will lead His people there, Jesus. You just need to look at the ending of Revelation 19 to 22 to see how Jesus leads his people into conquest and ushers in the new heaven and the new earth, the promised land, where we'll be with him eternally. And that is the encouragement, I'd say, of Numbers chapter 26 to 27 and that part of Numbers.